Welcome to our session discussing the truckers' blockade in Canada. We actually thought this is quite interesting for a number of reasons, obviously. On the LLA steering committee, I should say, there was kind of overwhelming agreement that this is probably not a socialist movement as such, and we should be very critical of it. Having said that, when we put out the advert, should socialists support the truckers in Canada, we've had about half people saying, of course you should, what a stupid question, and half said, well, of course you shouldn't, what a stupid question. So I think there's a lot of different opinions on this issue, and it's an interesting issue because it touches on something that's not just in Canada, of course. We have similar movements, the Yellow Vests in France. There's a bit on an attempt to have something similar as well here in Britain. It's linked to vaccine skepticism, I'd like to call it, without trying to cause any trouble. And it's also, of course, linked to the class situation of those truckers. Like an increasing amount of people, these truckers are all self-employed. I'm self-employed, precarious working conditions, etc. That makes them, in Marxist terms, part of the petty bourgeoisie. Does that still mean anything? A phrase like that? Does that mean, is that still a class that oscillates between the working class and the bourgeoisie? Can it be won over? Should we try to win it over? I think these are all questions that are quite interesting from a sort of socialist point of view. So we want to look at some of these issues around it. I actually promised we'd do a poll, but it doesn't work. I've just tried it; it doesn't work, unfortunately. So I think it would be quite interesting actually to do a poll of people on this, but I'm afraid technology is letting us down. So I'm very pleased now to have our first speaker on that issue is John Clarke. He's a former organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, and currently the Packer visitor in social justice at Toronto's York University. He'll sound very British because he is from Britain, but he lives in Canada. Welcome, comrade. If you could give us a little bit of an introduction about the situation at the moment and where you see the forces going and who they are. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if the title of this is "Should Socialists Support the Truckers in Canada?" My short answer would be no, but I feel I should elaborate a little bit in terms of developing this. The primary reason why I think it would be appalling for socialists to back what's unfolding right now in Canada in the form of this so-called Freedom Convoy is that it is unassailably a project of the far right. I won't bother going through the list of the who's who, but the 5-person core leadership are what Hate Canada has referred to as part of the far right ecosystem. They come out of the Western provinces. There's a Western separatist movement that has been long regarded a front for the far right. They actually call it Wexit. And that's what these people are linked to. One of the most notorious of them is a man called Pat King, a well-known Islamophobe and racist hate monger. You can find a video of him claiming that the 2 official languages of Canada, English and French, are going to be replaced by Chinese and Hebrew, giving you a bit of a sense of the kind of people who are behind this. One of the supporting organizations, the Diagon Network, has said that this must be Canada's equivalent of the Capitol Hill riot in Washington. So it's pretty clear what the perspective that these people have. And they've mobilized a significant number of people. They've mobilized demonstrations in the thousands. It would be, I think, a bit much to call it a mass movement, but it's very large, very significant, a huge organizational gain for the far right. the demands that they're putting forward are that that truckers be allowed to cross the US-Canadian border without being vaccinated. That doesn't make a lot of sense because the US has exactly the same requirement. So a trucker that was allowed to go would go a few hundred yards and be turned back. Moreover, they're calling for vaccine mandates to be abolished, but those have been implemented at the provincial level of government and not the federal level of government. So they're addressing it to the wrong people. But there's something very interesting about what they're actually putting forward. Their main, I think the most political organization they have in their midst is a group called Canada Unity. And the 5 people were party to the signing of a memorandum of understanding. And they put this forward at a press conference. And what they're calling for is for the Governor General, that being the Queen's representative in Canada under the Canadian system, the Governor General and the head of the unelected Senate, the equivalent of the House of Lords, is supposed to dismiss the elected members of Parliament and replace them with an emergency governing committee that will consist of the truckers, the so-called truckers leadership, and members of opposition parties. So they're actually thinking in terms of, you know, the kind of way, this is a kind of a rather premature march on Rome that they're putting together here. So it's really, really dangerous stuff. Now, I acknowledge this is not Mosley marching on Cable Street, in the sense that they are a fascist corps, well placed within the organisation, and they are putting forward demands that are demands around public health measures and vaccines and what have you. But clearly, the core driving, clearly the people that are driving this are well supported, and there is a strong white supremacist, white racist presence in the thing throughout. You see pictures of the truckers with their trucks adorned with Confederate flags. You see Confederate and Nazi symbols throughout all of the crowds. You see them getting up on the stage and proudly declaring themselves to be white supremacists. There is absolutely no question about what this is. In terms of it being a truckers movement, I think that is something that should be taken with an enormous grain of salt. One thing that is clear is that the people who are actually driving trucks are very much in the minority, but those people that are participating are obviously owner-operators. As you pointed out yourself, Tina, they are owner-operators. They are relatively well-off individuals who own large vehicles. If you drive a truck for a living and you work for a company, you don't get to take your truck off onto a protest when you go home. So it's very much, you described it as the petty bourgeoisie. I suppose you could say that's accurate. But the point about the trucking industry is that it is actually an industry that is rampant with real grievances and real issues. Some 90% of truckers are vaccinated, but amongst the people who work for a living driving trucks, the industry has been deregulated. There's wage theft is rampant within the industry. A huge portion of the workforce consists of racialized workers. 20% of truck drivers in Canada are actually South Asian. So if the grievances of truckers were the things that were being put forward, I would think that vaccine mandates would be quite low on the list. So it's not in any sense a legitimate mobilization of workers within the trucking industry putting forward their grievances. Now, they have put forward, they have been able to achieve a high level of disruption with their action. I'm not automatically opposed to disruption when working class and oppressed people disrupt, but this has been used for entirely reactionary purposes. What we're now starting to see is a strong reaction. There have been mobilizations of people to block these people and their supporting events throughout the country. Yesterday in Ottawa, where they're based, where they're camped, there was a huge mobilization of local people. A few dozen people gave a lead, and then hundreds and hundreds of people came out and blocked the supply routes into the truck convoy. Moreover, they are not enjoying massive support. Significant support within the polls show about 20% of people don't necessarily support the truck, the convoy, but support the objectives. But actually, the great majority of people are strongly opposed to what they're doing. In fact, a poll just came out showing that 62% of people favoured sending in the army against the truckers. Now, I'm certainly not calling for the deployment of military force, but that's an indication of how much anger there is directed against the thing that's taking place. Now, the thing that I think is really important to understand about this whole strategy that's being pursued, it's part of a long game. For a long time, far-right movements, and not just in Canada, have understood that they need to obtain legitimacy by latching onto issues that can get them access to a broader right-wing periphery. So a couple of years ago, very much the same cast of characters organized a truck convoy to Ottawa under the title of United We Roll. And this was a climate-denying pro-pipeline event. And what they discovered when they did it was that mainstream conservative politicians would give them uncritical support, and that it would give them access to a larger support base. And they put that into effect this time, there's no denying, with considerable effect. The police, moreover, have been entirely supportive of them. They've been a de facto babysitting service for these people, refusing to implement any serious measures against them. And that's hardly surprising, because their ranks are full of police and military. Their head of security is a former senior RCMP officer, that's the federal police force here, who was actually in charge of the Prime Minister's security detail. They also have a military intelligence officer who is reckoned to be one of the foremost experts in Canada in so-called anti-terrorism. So that's the kind of makeup of these people and what they represent. And I think the main political conclusion that has to be drawn from what's happening is that they have achieved what they've achieved, not through organizational brilliance, but they have simply filled a vacuum that has been created by, I must say candidly, the failure of working class movements to take up the kind of fight that needs to be taken in the face of this crisis. They're posing solutions, all focused on attacks on public health measures, but there's no question that across this country, and I know the same is true of the UK and the same is true of the United States, all across the country, the impact of the crisis is one that's calling out for serious action and serious mobilization around income support for people, around protection from evictions, about defense of healthcare systems. All of these things are critical, and no real lead has been given. And in that situation, it has created an opening for the far right. I'm very far from arguing in these volatile times that any movement that takes to the streets or the highways that has some contradictory and confused elements to it means that we should denounce it. But this is unassailably something that has been organized by fascists. And for socialists to in any way support something like this would be an enormous mistake. We have to build movements, we have to fight back. But if we don't know the difference between a far right mobilization and a working class fight back, then we've got real problems on our hands. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, comrade. I think that's given a good indication of what's happening. Sorry, somebody rummaging in the cupboard there. Thank you very much for setting the scene a little bit. I think I can see already in the chat, not everybody agrees with that. So I hope comrades who have a different view come in later into the discussion. Okay, Dan Lazare is our next speaker. He lives in the US and he is an author on constitutional issues and has also a lot to say about the ramifications of this in the US. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Tina, how are you? And John, that was really a great talk. I really learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know before. From America, what's so surprising is that Americans always view Canada as the sane portion North America. We think that that south of the border craziness reigns, and north of the border there's moderation and rationality. So to see a what seems to be a repeat of the Capitol Hill insurrection of January 6, 2021, taking place in Ottawa is really quite a surprise to us and really takes us aback. To me, what the event really reminds me of is a little less last January 6th than the events that started in late November of 2013 in Kiev, where there was also a barricaded community encampment, fortress, however you want to describe it, that took shape in central Kiev. That was essentially manned was led by ultra-rightists. It attracted a large number of the generally disaffected who were unhappy at the way things were going in the Ukraine, and that includes a great deal of the population. But there's no doubt that the leadership was composed of ultra-leftists, neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was no doubt about that at the time. And because the government of Kiev at the time was unwilling to use the force needed to break that encampment apart and disperse the encampment, and I'm not saying they should have, but certainly they lacked the strength and determination to do so. The encampment grew and grew and grew, and the confrontation deepened, until finally in late February of the following year, 2014, a coup d'etat was launched, a rebellion that aimed to change the government. And the then president was then chased out of the country. And a new government was installed, not through the normal democratic constitutional means, but through enormous pressure by this growing crowd on the streets that was spearheaded by ultra-right elements. So it seems to me that the scenario seems to be playing out along similar lines in Ottawa. I mean, the Trudeau government seems to be very weak, vacillating, uncertain how to respond. The truckers have essentially faced them with a very difficult, I guess you'd call it a military problem or whatever. I mean, those trucks are really hard to move. The people are ensconced there. They've got kids, they've got fuel, they've got a lot of stuff. So clearing that area would be very difficult, just as it would have been very difficult in Kiev in 2014. And the Trudeau government clearly is at a loss how to respond. So therefore, it seems that what's happening is that in parallel to earlier events in the Ukraine, the right-wing forces are growing. Some kind of counter forces are also growing. The government seems to be, just completely sort of, off by itself in the margins, completely perplexed as to how to respond in any effective way, and therefore some kind of the confrontation seems to be working itself towards some kind of climax. I don't know what that is. I don't know how to speculate. The idea, what you said about the appeal to the governor general, I guess it is, the royal representative, is fascinating. I mean, I don't know whether this has any kind of traction at all, whether it's realistic or it's just simply a bit of rhetoric that someone came up with at some point. But it's really remarkable, and it sort of shows how, it shows the similarities once again to the Ukraine. And I would just emphasize that the fact that these protests, that the convoy has inspired similar protests apparently in Britain and France, in other cities in Canada as well, just seems to show that the problem is not a national one, but it really is international, the evacuation of the left is a fact of life everywhere. The left seems to have just kind of completely marginalized itself, and allowing these kinds of just kind of anarchic, right-leaning, ultra-right-led forces to take over. So far, no movement capable of counteracting them has taken shape, and all the trends, all the forces seem to be in the other direction, i.e., against the left and in favor of the right. So I'm very surprised that it's Canada which is leading the way at this moment, because I thought that that privilege would accrue to the United States. But it's quite striking, and I'm not really quite sure where this neo-Ukrainian scenario will lead. But I think that the situation is more and more worrisome, because I think that some kind of climactic action seems to be impending. Anyway, that's it, Tina.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you both a couple of questions, if that's okay, before I bring in people from the floor. I mean, in Britain, we obviously had the defeat of the Corbyn movement, which I think has led to a lot of political confusion and people going off into all sorts of different directions now, including, I think, you know, sort of finding the vaccine skeptic movement, if I put it in a careful way, quite attractive. And that's finding a lot of traction within socialists as well, or lefties, which has surprised me quite a lot. I mean, overall, of course, we are seeing a period of where capitalism is in decline. It could carry on for a while longer if it's not pushed, but it could be pushed from either left or right. Do you feel that Dan touched on this a little bit, that the left has these people are totally alienated by any kind of left-wing movement, that they don't feel that socialists are the answer? Is that what is possibly happening? Would they be, you think they could be convinced by, you know, other arguments from the other side?
Who do you want to go first?
Go on, you're talking.
Well, in the U.S., the situation is especially acute. I mean, we saw in 2020 Bernie Sanders run for the presidency, and that garnered intense enthusiasm. And that was one of the most significant left-wing upsurges in some time. Although I must emphasize that Sanders, although he personally professes a kind of very watered-down socialism, ran as a Democrat, a member of a bourgeois liberal party. But the Sanders candidacy collapsed in February 2020, and since then, you know, a few individuals like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a left Democrat, and other members of what's called the Squad, 2 or 3 others, other left Democrats as well, have been increasingly marginalized. And Biden has come in, and Biden has been profoundly disappointing. The left seems to be de-energized. Sanders himself was reduced to sort of running interference for Biden in Congress, but you know, not putting forward any kind of, like, you know, independent program or independent, you know, criticism. And so what seemed to be a left-wing upsurge as of late 2019 or early 2020 has just completely evaporated. It's just off the radar screen, which is dominated by centrist Democrats and increasingly highly aggressive, and increasingly anti-democratic with a small d, Republicans. And they are the ones who seem to have the wind in their sails. So that's where things stand. So therefore, the idea of some kind of left-wing counteroffensive, I mean, I just don't know where it would come from at this moment. So it's just not in the picture. I've always assumed. I mean, I know Britain is far more advanced in this regard, and Canada is as well. So I've always looked with a certain degree of envy to those two countries. But in America, in the U.S., the situation is extremely bad. Anyway.
Well, the Sanders defeat, I think that's a bit similar to, I think, the Corbyn defeat, yes, that will have demobilized and demotivated a lot of people. John, what's it like in Canada with the left?
Well, I mean, I think, you pose the question, could these people be reached? The people, I mean, I actually have spoken to people in Ottawa who were involved in the action to block the truck convoy supply route. And they actually said that they had some fairly positive conversations with some of the people participating. So I think, in terms of the periphery of people that at one level or another are participating, it's possible that some of those people could be reached. But that's, I mean, the core people, of course, not the other side, they're the enemy. But the bigger question is, what kind of a lead can be given? I mean, that's and the same situation here. There's in an immediate sense, things look quite bleak. There wasn't a Corbyn project here. The New Democratic Party never had that kind of experience. It's remained pretty well locked, in my view, within a kind of an austerity consensus, and hasn't, nothing comparable to Corbyn happened. And the sort of, there's all kinds of really exciting efforts to challenge what's going on. The Ontario Health Coalition is challenging the degrading of healthcare systems in the middle of the pandemic. There's been a vigorous movement to challenge evictions. There's indications of a revival in terms of the workplace, but it's all at this point very tentative. And we have a situation where this convoy can swagger across the country, and trade unions here are not saying very much at all. Putting out a few statements saying it's nasty and the police should do their job, but not mobilizing any serious resistance. What's obviously got to happen is that there's got to be a critical mass of struggle. And just like Dan, I can't point to some ready-made solution that says that this is the way to make it happen. But I do know this, that in volatile times like this, things can change with incredible speed. And if a lead is given, it's remarkable what can happen. Just in Ottawa yesterday, the description I got of the event was that it was literally a couple of dozen people who just tried to sort of take a stand and block this convoy, and people started turning up out of their homes. And so I think that the counter to all the confusion, or the other side to all the confusion and uncertainty and turning inward that exists, is there is an incredibly volatile mood of anger that exists amongst working class people, and that can take shape, that can ignite. And I don't make predictions, but I'm not offering a pessimistic perspective. I think resistance is always possible, and sometimes it can take us completely by surprise.
Just want to pick you up on one point you made. There is the role of the unions. I mean, it seems that to a large degree, the precarious nature perhaps of truckers and their terrible working conditions is part of that reason. I mean, in Britain, Unite, under the new leadership of Sharon Graham, is I think making a really good effort trying to bring these people who are not part of a workplace. I mean, that's if you read Marx, that you get organized by being in a big working place. You talk to your fellow workers and you organize a union, etc. You're together, you solidarize, etc. People who live who have jobs like that where they're totally isolated from each other most of the time, it's difficult to organize them. Are there being efforts made in the US and in Canada to organize precarious workers? Would that make a difference in your view? Yes,
there are efforts that are underway. They're very, very small, very tentative. The most exciting news is what seems to be a very enthusiastic organizing drive among Starbucks baristas. and that's gotten a lot of attention. And the Starbucks baristas are classic precarious workers, young people who lack steady employment and do this, and they're paid very poorly. They work very odd hours, etc. And there seems to be an enthusiastic, quite enthusiastic movement, organizing movement among them. So that's really interesting. But it's a very small sector of the workforce, but nonetheless, perhaps a harbinger of larger things to come. I'm a big believer in the darkest before the dawn theory. I mean, to me, bleakness itself may be a leading indicator. When things get really black, that's when there's about to be a burst of sunlight to come through. But
fingers crossed. John, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, just simply that yes, there is organising going on, and very important organising. There's been a big campaign in the province of Ontario, where I live, around minimum wage and workers' rights issues. There's been a major effort to win that scored results in different provinces in terms of getting paid sick leave for people during the pandemic period. Those things have all been very, very precious. So I mean, I don't want to sort of create the perspective that, and I agree with Dan about the darkness and the light, but we're not just stumbling around in the darkness. There are people that are doing the spade work of trying to actually lay the groundwork for that revival. So I don't want to dismiss that, but that term critical mass is, I think, a decisive one. We certainly haven't arrived at that, but you read any of the history of great movements that spring up, and it's often the case that a couple of months before they happen, nobody saw them coming. So I have a great sense of that possibility. And if a crisis like this can produce a sudden organizational gain for the far right, then we certainly have to believe it can produce a huge working class upsurge.
Like Lenin a couple of months before the Russian Revolution, wasn't it? He said, "Oh, I'm not going to see the revolution in my lifetime, probably," and bam, changed world history. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in some people from the floor now. I'm going to bring in John first, who is in the US somewhere as well. You might know each other. It's so small over there.
We do.
Hi, John.
Hello.
What would you like to say?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
So first of all, I want to mention what John Clark was saying about the volatility in this situation. I agree that the situation is extremely volatile, including in the United States. And I also agree with what John was implying, that is the explanation for the extreme confusion that you tend to see in almost all popular movements today. I think the Yellow Vest movement is a great example of that. As far as the necessity for a left-wing counteroffensive, such a counteroffensive must involve centrally an insurgency within the unions in the United States. And that would have to take two forms. One is break from the Democratic Party, but also what largely gets ignored by the left is the union leadership's absolute insistence on what you could call the team concept. That is to say that workers and the employers have the same interests, and that the role of the unions, in effect, is to keep the employers happy. And that has led to massive alienation from the unions on the part of the union membership. And it's no accident that what is really more significant than the increased number of strikes at the end of last year was the fact that there was a whole series of contracts that were voted down again and again by the union membership. Now, the mention was made of the Starbucks organizing campaign. And we've also seen the campaign, what is even more significant in a way, to organize at Amazon. But we have to be very careful about that, in that 9 times out of 10, these organizing campaigns, the union bureaucracy gets a hold of them if they didn't organize them from the start. and they just drive it into the ground. And you've seen the death of one organizing campaign after another because of that. So again, for an organizing campaign to be successful, it's going to have to involve a direct clash with the entire union bureaucracy, including the so-called progressive wing of it. I want to comment also on some of John's points as far as COVID and the effect. And here in the United States, you've seen that a lot of the workers, and we have to remember that about 40% of the blue collar workforce voted for Trump in the last election and the previous one. A lot of the workers have not really suffered that much economically under COVID, but yet a lot of them have been caught up in all of the conspiracy theory, science denialism, and so on. And part of this is the effect of the 75-year campaign to suppress class consciousness and class struggle on the part of the union leadership. And another part, what's linked up with this, I think, is not just the union leadership, but also nearly the entire left really ignores what is really the central question around COVID, which is, as we know, a zoonotic disease, which is to say it jumped from a different species to the human species. And there's been a tremendous rise in zoonotic diseases over the last few decades. And the reason for that is the basis for capitalist development in many ways, which is factory farming and wild habitat destruction. And we have to start explaining that and explain that all the COVID denialism and the COVID conspiracy nonsense, that it is nothing and not at all a radical rejection of capitalist propaganda. In fact, it's an acceptance of capitalist propaganda. So I think that that's has to be an essential element in anything that we have to say about COVID. I can't help but I have to respond to what Daniel Lazare said about the 2014 uprising in Kiev, and he's just factually mistaken on everything that he says, including that the government didn't try to suppress it. They killed over 100 protesters in the beginning. The far right, the two right fascist parties, didn't even exist at the beginning. They came in afterwards when the liberals were just simply wanted to continue talking and trying to compromise. But anyway, that's a different issue. I think that what's happening in Canada is a lot more similar in some ways to the Tea Party protests here in the United States in an earlier period.
Thank you, John. Did either of you want to reply to the comrade before I bring in the next person?
No, not really. I don't agree with what he said about the 2014. I think this is really a peripheral question to this discussion, so I don't think there's any reason to go into it. But I do believe the analogy holds. I see some kind of confrontation brewing in Ottawa. I'm not sure what shape it'll take, but that's my sense. Anyway, that's it.
Okay, John, do you want to say something, or shall I bring the next?
No, bring some more people in.
Jonathan Bellows, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we're just getting away slightly from the origins of this blockade, and we're talking about what is basically a hijacking by the right wing of this to try and, I don't know, get Trudeau out of office or something like that. But what this points out to me is something we discussed, maybe it wasn't on Labour Left Alliance. It says no platforming. You see, basically the anti-vax voice, at least the informed one, those scientists who genuinely disagree with the mass vaccination policy in this particular case, have been silenced. And the truckers were doing this to get a recognition, to get a voice for them, to get noticed. And people are forgetting this. And in that, they've been very successful, because apart from Joe Rogan, who managed to interview a scientist who's an epidemiologist, I never pronounce that word, and also some others who've, particularly important guy called Mike Eden, who's managed to get out also on a completely private channel. You can't hear anybody else's reaction to the global vaccination policy. They are under the impression that something far more sinister is happening here, and that we're all falling for it. And I think this needs to be discussed. Whether you like the opinion on vaccination or not is neither here nor there. You may agree with the government line, but the point is they haven't been given a voice. And the truckers were doing this to get a voice. Now, admittedly, what's happened since, it's been taken over completely by the far right. Some really nasty people have got involved, and it's completely crazy, it's completely out of control. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't support the original decision of the truckers. I think that's a grave mistake, and we'll be proved in the long run that we've been conned. Okay, that's all I have to say. Okay.
Thank you, comrade. We've got a few more people. Actually, I'm going to bring in, I'd say 2 more before I bring you 2 back in, if that's okay. So Charlotte, please.
Yes, it's really interesting to hear what other people do have to say. Particularly, people keep calling this thing a vaccine when we all know that it isn't the same as a vaccine at all. When I had the polio vaccine when I was much younger, it stopped me getting polio, full stop. That's what a vaccine is. What we have at the moment is something which is still largely experimental, something where there are records, research records, which we are not being allowed to see by the commercial operators who are producing these injections. We are constantly being spun yarns, and other people are pointing out the yarns. And then we have the mainstream media, which is trying to state that everything that they don't agree with is a conspiracy, therefore, and we're all wrong. Well, no, we've all lived our own lives. We've all worked out where the liars lie. We try to rephrase that every time we hear different people to see whether this time they might be telling the truth. And what we've had over the last 2 years is deliberate fear engendered right across the world, and particularly in what we laughingly know as the West, so that we all separate out from our societies and remain even more fear-struck. And we don't support each other. What the truckers are doing very firmly is they are supporting each other. They are then getting lots of people who agree with them, who have made online donations to help them to do what they're doing, which is a brave gesture. It puts their own lives and livelihoods at extreme risk because they're facing on against governments. And these governments show what they're likely to do against people who disagree with them. We all know this. We all know about things like extraordinary rendition. Not that I'm saying that is likely to come in here, but the point is harms are done to people. These people are taking an immense risk, and the mainstream media is going out of its way to lie about them, to claim they're far right. I've been watching over and over again videos that are put out by those people to do with the truckers. And you see lots of panning around with the video. You can see happy people who are determined. This is not something which the mainstream media is promoting to us all, and therefore it shouldn't be listened to. We have a right to state what we will not put up with, and I believe that's what they're doing. I'll shut up and go away now, Tina. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Well, that was a different view. Either of you want to reply to the comrade? I mean, I think we should try and stay out of the whole vaccine issue. I don't think any of us are, scientists or whatever, but politically, where do you see these two movements.
Yeah. Okay, well then I'll say, I think just, and I'm very glad for the advice to stay out of the vaccine issue to a good extent, but I think that just factually, the take that was given on this movement is just not true. I mean, this is not a group of people with some views on the vaccination issue who found themselves hijacked by this unaccountable right-wing force. This is an event that was organized by fascists from day one. The 5 people who formed the core leadership group that planned it, they built it on the basis of earlier initiatives that had been taken up. This was not hijacked, this was organized by them. And as to this outpouring of funding from ordinary people, the word has just come out where their sources of money come from. For this event, they raised $10 million. That's a lot of money. I've been involved in a lot of community-based organizing, and that's an astounding sum of money to be able to raise for that kind of action. And their corporate and big business funders have been named. So there's no question about what this is, who's backing it, and such like. On the question of disagreements over vaccines, I won't try and settle the matter, but I think that I certainly feel if someone wants to raise issues about the vaccine, that they should be free to do so. I certainly think people should be free to put forward their points of views, and we should discuss them on their merits. But what's absolutely essential, and what I came here primarily to try to do, was to demonstrate to people what this event in Canada is, what it represents, and long after the issue of this pandemic and vaccines have receded from the main focus of what we're talking about, the threat posed by the very forces that are mobilizing this trucker convoy is going to be a very real one. And we better be ready to have a response, and we better be ready to pose an alternative to these people.
Can I just ask, I've said we tried to have a third speaker, but she had to pull out, and she said Elon Musk is involved in financing or supporting the truckers. Is that something that's proven? Is that a rumor? Have you heard about that?
I'm aware that he's issued a statement in support of them, but I don't know that he's one of the funders.
Okay. Daniel, did you want to say something?
Just that I'm highly sympathetic to Charlotte's point of view. I mean, I think that what we've seen over the last 20 years with economic polarization has been that a large portion of the population has been thrust down, sort of marginalized. The chattering classes, the top 10%, have kind of pulled away economically and pulled away politically as well. We've seen this phenomenon of Brahmanization of all the political parties across the board, including, in actually in some ways it's even more pronounced on the left than it is on the right. And so ordinary people have been shut out of the political debate. The political debate has been monopolized by the top economic rungs. There's been a growing tendency to talk down to people. And of course, the mainstream media, the bourgeois press, I mean, it's just beyond despicable. I mean, they lie. I mean, their relationship to the truth is so tangential. It's amazing. So I don't blame people for being suspicious, and I don't blame them for listening to alternative voices. And I'm not surprised that those alternative voices can at times be rather wacky. But at the same time, we've got to face the fact that the world is faced with an unparalleled health emergency. No one quite knew how to respond. The quarantine principle was seized on very early, and the quarantine principle rests on separation. The quarantine principle arose in Italy in the Renaissance before they had any concept whatsoever of germ theory, but they noticed that when people separated, diseases were not stopped being communicated. So therefore, that basic principle was put into effect before any vaccines came on the scene. And those principles they're coercive. I guess you I guess that term is appropriate. I mean, no one likes being locked in their houses, separated from their families, etc. Causes real hardship. It should have been explained better. The lines of communication should have been explained better, but we just can't react to it in an irrational way. We've got to be more rational than the political classes, not less. I mean, the irrationality is simply not a response. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, Felicity next, please, and then I'm going to bring in Matthew Jones.
Yeah, hi. I've been listening to the debate, and I have a question. Are the left just pissing in the wind? Really? We're just getting more and more within ourselves. And this whole vaccine nonsense, and it is nonsense, because sadly, I think the left, as well as the right, because as I think it was Daniel said, they're so frustrated that they have to take a different stance. I mean, I think they've been hijacked. I honestly think they've been hijacked. But I suppose my question is, do you see parallels to what's happening? I mean, the exponential rise of the right, it's not just some airy-fairy thing. It's going on, and it's very, very dangerous. The left is being quarantined. We're being sidelined. Do you see parallels with things like Weimar in the 1920s, the 1930s? I know it's different, but in the sense, the rise of the right, especially in North America and especially in Europe, as you should say, and that is now, can you say, infecting North America? I mean, Trump and what have you. Yeah, that's really my question.
Thanks, Felicity.
Thanks.
Matthew, did you want to come in? Then you need to switch on your camera, please. There you are.
Thanks, comrades. No, I think the key thing is, as comrades have said, is this is organised by the far right and the fascists, and actually originates from. I mean, if you look at United We Roll, the original right-wing convoy, which was some years ago, it was used as a strike-breaking movement against, particularly, I think, a strike of refinery workers. And so, I mean, there's not any issue with it. It is a movement of the far right, and it doesn't. I mean, it's clearly based on a quite narrow base. I mean, the truckers' organisations have largely condemned it. It's a small, relatively small group, but what it does have is an enormous degree of support, both within obviously the Trump faction, which is now dominant in the Republican Party, and therefore it has the availability or the ability to raise huge amounts of money, because obviously there's now a large section of the ruling class itself, in the US, and I'm presuming in Canada as well, that is prepared to fund this stuff, is prepared to give money and to use this thing. I mean, this is obviously a deliberate effort to bring down the government and to move the whole process, everything, to the right. Whole Canadian politics to the right by means of this form of sort of putschism almost. And under conditions, I mean, where it's now obvious, I mean, clearly it also has sympathy of large chunks of the state machine. I mean, you can see, the difference between if the left had held this demonstration, obviously they'd have been bludgeoned off the street and locked up, and you can see the difference between what happened. I mean, particularly clearly, obviously in Washington, between what happened when a few people, a crowd, basically were supporting Black Lives Matter and were attacked with every kind of force and projectile that the cops had, the National Guard, the Parks Guard, assorted goons that Trump could find in various, of the darker portions of the US state machine. And all sorts, some of which was completely unlawful, even under US law, which is bad enough. And the contrast between that and what happened on January the 6th last year, when the far right was able to walk into the Capitol with almost no serious resistance at all. The odd copper, who basically suffered. And of course, a lot of the coppers are actually quite sympathetic to the whole business. They were having their photographs taken with the protesters. So actually, of course, the state machine, not only the capitalist class, but the state machine is in sympathy with these people as the whole thing, is moved to the right. To set up, the huge sort of attacks that are coming on the working class. There's no question of it. But I think that I think people have to catch on with the questions of vaccines as well, because clearly, the science is there. I think you can criticise big pharma, and you can criticise governments quite clearly, but I don't think you can criticise the science. And you also have to understand that there's millions of people that actually died from COVID. And millions of people are still in the process. I mean, the death toll in the US is now approaching 1 million people. It's extraordinary. I mean, there's not been some kind, a greater response than that in terms of basically the large numbers of people basically been left to be infected and die in the most horrible ways. And I think I think we have to support. We should support vaccination, but we need to hold governments to account on their lack of action to protect the populations, which they could have done far more to do. But in these terms, I mean, this whole business is this shift a whole lot to the right. I also agree with John Ryman when he's talking about the whole question of the union bureaucracy, which becomes absolutely central. Not just in the US and Canada, but also here, and is now being used as a very central point of fifth column against the working class organising itself. And in terms of trying to destroy any kind of fight, and to maintain isolation between different groups of workers, which is critical, obviously. I mean, once you get a movement which accumulates a certain momentum and so on, and workers come together, then obviously it's much more difficult to stop. But what they're doing is quite consciously isolating struggles and then grinding them down and getting rid of them. And the question is how do the working class and the left break through that strategy? Which is, the use of that union machine. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Either of you two want to reply to what any of the last two speakers said?
Okay, you want to go then?
Sure, I'll go. I agree with both Felicity and Matthew very strongly. I think that I get a sense that things are just like great fissures are opening up in a number of Western societies, and that there is a dramatic shift underway to the right. This is true in the U.S. To my surprise, it seems to be true in Canada, true in Great Britain as well. And now, of course, we have a possibility of a war erupting, in the Ukraine, which could spread across much of Europe. So I think that things are really breaking up, and I think that there could be a dramatic push to the right as a consequence. And there's also the economy, which is very unstable. Anyway, John, over to you, please.
Yeah, well, I think I almost entirely agree with both of the previous speakers myself. And the only thing I think I would like to add is that I sounded a note of warning about what this trucker convoy represents and how dangerous it is. But I don't, on the other hand, think that we should just conclude that the sky is falling and it's the end. I think this is a dangerous development. But first of all, there's, I think, a real possibility that they overplayed their hand. I've organised. I was an organiser with a group called the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty for a lot of years, and so I know that one of the big mistakes you make is to go into something that's confrontational with no exit strategy, and that's the situation that these people are in already, with great reluctance the police have had to come in and clear them away from the Ambassador Bridge, which separates the town of Windsor in Ontario from Detroit, one of the main chokeholds for the supply chain that's passing through there. And there is no question that, however reluctantly, there's going to be a move against them by state forces if they don't find some way to disperse with some kind of declared victory or whatever. So they've overplayed their hand. It's also true that while they are backed by some big money, I don't think we can say that we can conclude that, you know, the main body of the Canadian establishment and ruling class is ready to throw its hand in with the kind of people that are organising the truck convoy. We haven't arrived at that situation yet. That could happen, but it hasn't happened yet by a long way. But the other thing I think is that we've got to recognise, and it's sort of been alluded to, is that this development comes out of what is really an unprecedented crisis. None of us have ever seen a situation like this, right? This pandemic itself, I think, is a reflection of the fact that the social and economic system that we all live under has reached a point where it is incapable of maintaining a sustainable relationship with the natural world itself, right? And that's creating incredible developments. So the United Nations tells us that we've entered the era of pandemics. We have climate change hanging over us. We have all these things, and it's creating a huge, huge societal crisis and an economic one too. And that puts us in situations that none of us has ever seen. It creates great dangers, but it opens up incredible possibilities as well. So I think we need to look for those openings. We need to look for those ways forward, and we have to do it. We have to talk on the left constructively, in a comradely way, and try to find ways forward in this situation. But this is not some, you know, we're not about to be taken over by the forces of darkness. We have fight left in us yet by a long, long way.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. We've got a few more people with their hands up. So comrades, we're trying to finish by 7:30. So I'm going to try and cut you short a little bit. Victor, please, for 2-3 minutes. Oh, Victor, there's a lot of background noise.
Hello, I'm here.
Okay, make a comment then, please.
I hope you can hear me. Acknowledge, please.
Yes,
Right.
You.
Well, we're in an unusual situation here. We have people amongst us are still re-parroting the Blairite mantra that these truck workers are somehow or other secret undercover Nazis, extremists. We'll probably soon be getting told that they're all Russian agents and working for Putin, no doubt. It's funny how many supposed sellout socialists are only too ready to sell out truck workers or any genuine effort by workers, but are so silent on the Blairite takeover of the so-called left in this country. I think there's something we ought to remember, two things we should remember. None of these Blairite stooges have the courage of their conviction to debate their rubbish with the truck workers. And secondly, it's probably the same Blairite sellout socialists who've infiltrated the truck workers and are telling them behind our backs that we're all right-wing anti-Semites. How many of us have been kicked the Labour Party, branded by the BBC as anti-Semites? It's time we grew up and stopped playing that silly game, isn't it? And let me acquaint you with one last fact, because I know there's no enthusiasm for my opinions here, and that is this. When we had our protest in Victoria against the Blairite witch hunt purge against us, where we were being framed as far-right anti-Semites, you might remember, before they did that to Jeremy Corbyn. The only people who came to our support was Jeremy Corbyn's elder brother, together with a large group of his supposed far extreme right vaccine critics. They came and supported us in Victoria. None of these so-called anti-Nazi League or Black Lives Matter people, not one of them lifted a finger to support us. It shows the extent of the far-right, extreme Blairite infiltration by war criminals amongst us. It's time we rooted these people out. Thank you.
Okay, yes, little clarification there, because I was one of the organizers of that protest, Victor. They came and tried to take over our protest. They tried to snatch the microphone from us. They did not support us. They wanted to take over our thing. We had a clash with them, so that wasn't great, that event, and they certainly did not want to support us. Steve Freeman, please.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, comrades. It's partly I'm going to ask John a question, but I know that Dan is into this idea as well and has talked about it. But to me, there's a dual crisis. There's a twofold crisis going on here. On one hand, there's clearly a crisis of capitalism, a crisis of neoliberalism, and self-employed workers. Some have been forced to be self-employed workers who are self-employed. They are victims of that crisis. Obviously. And then there's a crisis of democracy. Now, I wasn't aware of a crisis of democracy in Canada, but when people think the political system is not solving their problems, right, they get to be a little bit angry about it. Now, it seems to me, and that's where I think the class analysis comes in, and Tina was right at the beginning, if we're mainly talking about a petty bourgeois movement, and I mean by that in the technical sense of being self-employed, not employed workers with their own trucks and so on and so forth, then it was always said that in a crisis like this, the petty bourgeoisie will be driven mad by capitalism because of the helplessness that they feel in relation to it, and therefore will respond sometimes quite radically, sometimes in quite a militant way. And naturally, because we like radicalism, we generally going to look in that direction, but we have to have a very, very clear understanding of what they are and what they represent. The crisis of democracy and the crisis of capitalism means that we get fascism, whose answer to the crisis of democracy is, let's take the democracy that we've got away. Trump was trying to do that, by the way, in the coup that he tried to organize. Now, it seemed to me that if this movement, and you look at the demands of the movement, is calling for the Governor General, right, and the Senate to dismiss an elected government, okay, what's the thinking that goes into that kind of way? That is quite right-wing, anti-democratic thinking. You could even conceive of that argument. So I think that there's a difference between supporting their demands, like that the Governor General intervenes and all that sort of stuff, and intervening in the movement and trying to explain to these to people. They're a part of the people, if you like, to explain to them the situation and try to explain to them what the problem is and what the solutions actually are to the problems that they face. Right? We're not on the side of the government when we do that. So I'll finish there, but just by asking perhaps John and Daniel, John especially, simply to say, do you see there's a crisis of democracy? Does it look as if Canadian democracy is failing? Because I can see it's failing in Britain, and I can see it's failing in America. But until this moment, I had no idea that it was kind of particularly failing. Generally, it should be failing. But the crisis of democracy in Canada, are people dissatisfied with the political system that you've got in Canada and its inability to sort out these sort of problems? So it's like a question.
Yeah. Do you want to reply to that straight away? We've got two more speakers and then we can sum up after that.
Yes, of course. I think that's a good way to put it. A crisis of democracy, but a crisis of the parliamentary representative system, I think is clearly absolutely true. One of the striking things about this period is that the parties of the political centre, the mainstream, are, I think, finding themselves increasingly experiencing a crisis of legitimacy. The Trudeau government it's the Liberal Party, And one of the things people in Britain don't have since Lloyd George's people went into a state of faded glory in the early in the 20th century, people haven't dealt with a robust, powerful liberal party of big business, but with a progressive spin on it, such as exists here. And the Liberal Party is enormously discredited at this particular point. It disappoints and attacks working class people, and the right is in a frenzy against it, and that's very much part of what's happening. So when these people are calling for the dismissal of the elected members of parliament, that's obviously something we would oppose from any rational perspective, but they're picking up on something. They're picking up on that profound sense of dissatisfaction and anger that exists out there. And I think Steve's point is entirely correct, is that we can, that if a real fighting alternative is posed by the working class, then many of the kind of people who would gravitate, the polls show 20% support in Canada of the truckers' aims, if not what they're actually doing. Those groupings in society, I believe, yes, can be won over in large measure. But we've got to I think we've got to pose that alternative, and that's the crisis.
Sorry, there's been some background noise, but thank you for that, John. Dan, did you want to say?
Yeah, I do actually. Of course, I second everything that Steve said. We live in a global system which is ruled by the United States, and the United States in the center is a sense in the center of the structural crisis. I mean, I've written about this for literally decades. The U.S. lives under a 234-year-old constitution, which is remarkably unchanged since the 18th century. It is profoundly undemocratic, racist as well, I should add, and this kind of deep freeze, and it's freezing up. It's in a process of actually freezing up now, and this deep freeze that originates in the U.S. emanates throughout the U.S.-controlled world, which is most of the globe, or at least much of it, and so the whole global political structure is frozen. It's just immobilized. The concept of a nation state, by the way, is increasingly, losing force in the face of problems that are clearly global, global warming, one, pandemics, another, et cetera. Economic polarization applies not only within countries, but globally as well, and it really has reached profound levels. So yes, this kind of deep structural freeze is very important. The U.S. is cracking wide open. We are moving from a quasi-semi-democracy to what seems to be an increasingly anti-democratic state, and we'll see what happens, whether this freeze deepens or if the freeze just sort of breaks wide open. Because I think things are very unstable. Even as things are tightening up, they're also very unstable. So we'll see where they lead. But certainly, the working class, the global proletariat, this is the only force which is capable of essentially attacking this problem in a constructive way, and out of it creating some kind of new, higher egalitarian democracy. That's it.
Absolutely, well put. I think there's a debate about how we should support these truckers or not, but by themselves they're definitely not the solution. The solution has to come from the conscious working class majority. Rebecca, please.
Oh, thank you, Tina, and thank you to the speakers. I haven't been following what's been going on in Canada, so I joined this to learn. And I feel I have learned a lot. There are a couple of things that I wanted to say, both in response to the speakers, but also in response to some of the chat. I agree with what John just said what we want is a fighting alternative. And I feel this issue about vaccines is actually a wedge issue and not a helpful issue. When people are talking about big pharma, by and large, I would agree with what people say. Of course it's exploitative. Of course it's charging grotesque amounts of money to help people live. And that's what we should be campaigning about. We shouldn't be running around the streets saying, it's my right not to have a vaccine. We should be running around the streets saying it's everybody's right to have access to a vaccine. And why are you not doing it? Why is the patent not free? That's the sort of thing we should be campaigning about. I'm getting very old now, and I tell you, I was brought up in an era when I was taught, even if it cost me something, even if it cost me a risk, if it benefited society, then I must do it. And I think since, well, in the UK, you may or may not be aware of Thatcher's famous quote, there's no such thing as society now. We're all a bunch of individuals. And I see this being played out in attitudes to taking a vaccine. Because you take a vaccine not to save yourself, you take it to save everybody else. My children were vaccinated. They were born at the time of the MMR scandal, which was, of course, bogus research anyway. But as a mother who had worked many a long year to get my children, with a lot of treatment as well to get them, they had the vaccine. I was scared, but it was for the good of society. And I'm becoming increasingly annoyed by this individualism where people have lost that concept. So it's not about you, it's about us. And so I think, going back to John's point, we want ideas to fight for. Yes, there's a pandemic. Yes, you're quite right, because of capitalism, agriculture, planet destruction, there's going to be more global pandemics. And the issue isn't, ooh, what should I do? It's what we do for everybody on the planet. And we highlight what capitalism and the destruction is doing. And to be honest, if we don't campaign on those issues and we just go, oh, I think I'll go on an anti-vax march, that is pissing in the wind. Anyway, thank you for letting me say that. And thank you, Tina, for organising this.
Thank you. Okay, we have one more speaker, and I suggest we then bring this to a close and have the two speakers reply to some of these comments. It's Malcolm, please.
Now you can hear me.
We can.
Yeah, it's quite hard to comment. Everything's been talked about, hasn't it? More or less. I don't know very much about Canadian truckers, so I'm not going to talk about them. This is there was a couple. Well, the rise of the far right is quite interesting, because I don't know whether you remember. I suppose you don't, because you're probably most of you younger than me. A program called "Till Death Us Depart" on British television. And this was supposed to expose and ridicule people who held far-right views in a person played by Warren Mitchell, who in fact was a socialist. And the whole idea was to make it, sort of make ridicule of people who held far-right views. And sexist views and so on. But unfortunately, it completely backfired because Warren Mitchell was such a good actor. He could make it so before the program to say, oh, a couple of packies down there, a load of packies, aren't they? They're all packies down there. I mean, it sort of made it almost all right to say it, where there was a big pressure at the time to say, well, this was a sort of racist remark, which it obviously was. And so his popularity wasn't just because he was a very good actor, which he was, but the popularity was because he was actually espousing the views that many people were sympathetic with. And so the far right, or however far you want to call them, people who hold views that might be called right-wing, racist views, sexist views, I don't know what sort of views, they were made respectable and by the program, which was very upsetting, I guess, for the writer Johnny Speight, who I think was on the left, and Warren Mitchell, who was on the left. But what it exposed was the far right was there. I mean, the far right always is mostly there, and because it pops out now and then, people say, oh, everything's gone to the right. It's not, it's just that they've appeared. And the other thing I wanted to say, which is sort of related, a number of reports have come out recently about a place called Israel, saying it's apartheid, it's repressive, and so on and so forth. And the people running it are not sort of people we want to associate with, except the Labour Party. Labour MPs have a club called the Friends of Israel. Now, I can't understand this at all, because the Labour Party is supposed to be Democratic Socialist Party. And I can't see that Friends of Israel could be part of the Labour Party. But if you look at the Friends of Israel, it's only open to Labour MPs. A third of the current Labour MPs are Friends of Israel. Now, if you read the Amnesty report, the Human Rights Watch report, anything about it, I mean, you don't want to be Friends of Israel, do you? And so I find it very, very peculiar. And nobody seems to be saying anything about it at all. I mean, the leader of the Labour Party, and several have stood up and said, well, I'm a thoroughgoing Zionist. And it seems very strange. I can't see how being a Zionist can square with being a democratic socialist. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Malcolm. Okay, comrades, I think that was quite a wide-ranging and very interesting discussion. I think if the poll function would have worked, I think we might have come out 50-50 or something, perhaps after the discussion a bit more towards your view, but who knows? There's a very vibrant discussion in the chat. I thank you very much for coming along tonight. I hope you can give like a few minutes each to sum up some of the comments that were made, or where you think we can go from here. Perhaps you first, John.
Yes. Okay. Well, I noticed that Alf Garnett and Margaret Thatcher both came up in the discussion. And I'd like to pick on the latter, and the very important comment you made, a dreadful one, but precisely about there being no such thing as society. I mean, obviously this was selective reasoning. If an inmate of one of Her Majesty's prisons had said, since there's no such thing as society, I'd like to go home, I imagine she would have took a very dim view of it. But what she meant was that the state should not provide. And she certainly put that into effect, and it was put into effect internationally, and it's had devastating results. So that, I think, is precisely the climate out of which this trucker convoy emerges. Thatcher's statement was a statement of cruelty and a statement of despair, and a statement that must be the exact opposite of what everybody involved in this meeting stands for. And there has to be created in people a sense of hope. And that can't just be done by, as important as it is to have these discussions, it won't be done by discussions. It has to be done practically. We have to demonstrate to people that collective action can make a difference. There is politically a way forward. And you see signs of that everywhere. I just saw in Britain the demonstrations around cost of living and how vital that was. Sharon Graham and Unite came up. These examples of people beginning to fight back and organise are the building blocks of what we've got to bring together. We've got to take action and we've got to give it a political direction. The truckers, so-called truckers, are for the Canadian movement a slap in the face. And hopefully that slap's going to wake us up, because the need to act and the need to act decisively is an absolutely imperative one at the moment.
Thank you, comrades. Dan, please.
I'll be very, very brief. First of all, in response, John Riemann challenged me to come out and say that the call for a new, higher form of egalitarian democracy means socialism, and he is absolutely correct. The S word is very important because of course, tremendous social forces are building up, not only political forces. There's a large part of the population which has been shut out, treated increasingly badly, hurting very badly, very angry. They have no way to express their anger, unfortunately. And unfortunately, some of that anger winds up being expressed in irrational, antisocial ways. So it's the job of the left to open up a route towards the rational reconstruction of society along socialist lines, a task which has to be international, not merely national, because it'll fail on a national level. And so it's got to adopt a very broad strategy, recognizing that political institutions, economic institutions must be rebuilt, and the only force that's capable of doing this is the working class, the international working class. So I'll leave that. I think this is a great meeting, by the way, a really great meeting, a wonderful discussion. My thanks to you, Tina, for putting it together. I think it's very timely and really very good. So thanks.
Thank you very much. It wasn't just me, it was the steering committee of the Labour Left Alliance, but thank you very much for coming on. I really enjoyed it as well. I think it's an example, I think, what we can do as an international working class, and we were from all over the place, aren't we? And it's very important that we do work through these things together. I think, as Dan said, it's, you know, there's different views on how we engage with the truckers, but that's not the solution. The solution has to be us and the organized working class with the unions and political organizations, which need rebuilding, not just in Britain, but across the world. I think we have to get back to some of the basics, what is actually socialism and how we can get there. So I agree with, of course, with John, what he says, you know, the working class must move, but it also must move into a direction, doesn't it? I mean, the left has failed for some decades to provide answers, I think, to inspire people and to fight for a better society. So, you know, education like this, I think, is important to clarify which direction we're actually going, which is needed to get, you know, once the working class moves again, to give it that understanding which direction it actually should be moving. And I'd like to finish very much with Dan's point. I think that the darkness before the light, I think that's we need to keep our spirits up and our hope up that there will be a light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you very much for attending, comrades. On Thursday, we've got our regular education series again that I think most people on this call know about. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.